Good afternoon. So, this is our first class. This is our first class. It is a course about the alternative futures of the market economy, and also about the way to think about the market economy. I have the honor to teach this course with Danny Roderick, with which I have taught it before. We share many views, and we disagree about other things, as you will see during the course. A very important instrument for engagement in the course is the course website. We have assigned certain books, and the readings that are not in those books are posted on the course website. Undergraduates in this course will be enrolled in a weekly section meeting. But in general, we intend to conduct this course as a combination of provocations by the two of us and discussion in every class. The two of us will be present in every class. One of us will begin the class, the other will continue, and then we'll reserve a major part of each class for conversation. Is there something else I should mention, Danny, by way of logistical introduction?
No. There are questions. I might say a word maybe about the requirements. They're spelled out on the syllabus, but it's a little bit unusual in that different groups have different requirements. So there's undergraduates and law school students and Kennedy School students all have different requirements. I just want to make sure that those of you who are taking the course from the Kennedy School realize that there is a weekly 3-pager due before the morning of each class. So that's also spelled out, the requirements for that. The topic of those memos will be typically put on the course website on Canvas sometime on the Monday before. So for the first of those memos is due next Monday at 8 a.m. The topic will be posted sometime today, and that will be the pattern, and there will be 10 of those.
All these requirements are explained in the course syllabus, which we have distributed here and is also posted on the course website.
Right. Let me get a sense of who is, so I know that there are a number of auditors, but just those of you who are either are taking or thinking seriously of taking this course for credit. How many from the Kennedy School here? Okay. Law school? College? Okay. And just a show of hand of auditors. Okay. If it looks like people have to sit on the steps or on the floor, we might try to find a bigger room. But in our experience, the size of the audience fits the room. So we won't do anything about that to start out with. But if it does get crowded, we will look for alternatives. So in terms of housekeeping, that's about it. We'll move.
I think just we should introduce Mohammed Hamdi, who is the teaching assistant for undergraduates. And he will be in touch with the undergraduates about the weekly discussion meeting.
Any questions about the organization of the course or requirements? Anything that's unclear?
Does this course always start from 110?
Yes. So it starts at 1:10, and we continue without breaking until 3. Okay. Yes.
So it will be mainly lecture-based followed by in-class discussions?
So as Roberto said, typically one of us will start for about 20, 25 minutes. The other will respond. We will have some back and forth. And then we'll try to reserve a large chunk of the session to broader sort of discussion and debate with all of you. So that's the typical way in which it's going to go. Okay.
And there's one more thing that I should mention that's actually very important. These classes are videotaped. And the videotape will be placed on the course website 2 or 3 days after each class. So there's no need to take copious notes during the class. Better to focus on the argument.
Also, I will typically have, just as today, I will have a few slides, and don't worry about taking down those slides or the notes on those slides, because they will be put on the course website as well after class. So you don't have to worry about just taking everything down. Okay, very good. So we'll start. I will begin today's class with just a few introductory comments about the mostly really about facts. I want to make sure that we have a common baseline of a set of empirical facts that serve as background to the discussion that we're going to have. These facts are going to, many of which, if not most or all, are things that you might be familiar with. But it's important to lay them out and make sure that they are the common empirical background against which our discussions will proceed. At the very end, I'll end with just sort of saying a couple of words about where we're heading in terms of the substantive discussion about our alternatives, and then turn it over to Roberto. Let me start out with growth. We pay significant attention to economic growth in this course, not because we think growth is the end of everything, but because we think that it's important in terms of expanding the capabilities of individuals and households and communities over their environment and improving their well-being alongside other dimensions of well-being, of course. This chart shows you essentially going back to 1950 what has been happening to economic growth in sort of 2 parts of the world, dividing the world economy into a rich and a relatively less rich or poor part, so the advanced versus developing countries. And what you should focus on are just the trend lines here, because the annual growth rates tend to fluctuate a lot. Those are the dots. And the interesting thing here is that up until the 1990s, the advanced part of the world economy, developed countries, actually grew more rapidly than the poorer parts of the world. Now, that's a little bit of an anomaly, because you would think that the poorer countries ought to converge in terms of overall incomes, and that if in a kind of world where it's easier to catch up than to push the frontiers of technology and innovation, we should expect the poorer parts of the world to grow more rapidly than the rich. That, by and large, was not the case up until the 1990s. And then until the 90s, since the 90s, in fact, that picture has been reversed. In fact, as you can see from that, I guess, the orange trend line, the developing countries have been growing much more rapidly than the developed countries. You will see sort of a very, sort of a quite significant ramp up of the growth of the developing part of the world economy. That's a little bit of a statistical illusion because it is largely accounted for by one country, albeit a very large one country. That's, of course, China. And because China has been growing so rapidly since the 1980s, it not only has contributed to this upward movement in the trend growth rate of the developing world, but as it grows, it becomes bigger and bigger. So it becomes a bigger share of the developing world, and therefore developing countries look like they're growing more rapidly. It's really largely one such country, although, as we'll see in a second, even if not quite to the same extent, many other developing countries have grown rapidly, especially in the last 2 decades as well. A couple of other things to notice. One is that there is a trend, downward trend in the growth rate of the advanced countries. So you will see that developed countries were growing in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, something around 3% of GDP, per capita GDP. That has sort of grown, has tended to come down. Of course, because these are sort of trend lines, the effect of crises, like the oil crisis or the financial crisis of 2008, which we will talk about considerably, or for that matter, for the developing countries, the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s. Those are things that don't show up in those trend lines because they've been smoothed. Finally, at the very tail end of the curve for the developing countries, you also see another sort of movement downwards of the developing countries. So there has also been a kind of a reduction in the growth rate recently of the developing world, but by and large, this growth differential still is quite in favor of the developing world. Developing world, of course, is not just one thing. If we disaggregate the developing world into sort of regional aggregates, so differentiating between Asia, Africa, and Latin America, we see, of course, the best performance is in Asia. That's the top one. Again, very much pushed ahead by China's contribution, although recently India has been playing a role as well. If you look at Latin America, which is sort of the green, has sort of not particularly distinguished, but somewhat of a recovery since the low points of the 80s, the Latin American debt crisis. More encouragingly, sub-Saharan Africa has actually significantly increased its growth rates. Sub-Saharan Africa experienced a growth boost early in the post-war period, especially after decolonization, and then in the 70s and 80s did rather poorly, and again in the last 2 decades or so has been growing more rapidly. So what do we ultimately, of course, the reason that we care about these growth rates is in terms of what it does to things like poverty. And I'll come to that in a second. But if we look at the sort of the more near term, looking at the patterns of growth in the advanced industrial countries since the global financial crisis, we see that there has been a recovery in most of those countries, but that the recovery has been actually quite differentiated and partial. Look at GDP per capita on the left panel. The country that overall has done the best is Germany. That's not going to surprise you. The country that has done the worst is Italy, where in fact per capita GDP still remains significantly below the levels it had reached before the global financial crisis and the Eurozone crisis of just about a year ago. So very different performance. Similarly, with respect to unemployment, quite significant dispersion in unemployment rates still across the major industrial countries. We're going to be talking a lot about the new economy in this course, innovation, technological change, and how to make it work for society at large. There, we're confronting a kind of a puzzle or a paradox that even though sort of talk about the new economy and the internet and automation and new technologies and robotics and biotech is all around, you don't see that much of it in the aggregate numbers, or at least yet. So in fact, if you look at our broadest measure of productivity change in the economy, which is sort of that's what technology is supposed to do, to increase the overall productivity with which the economy's resources are used. We call that the total factor productivity, a measure of productivity that aggregates all factors of production, capital, labor, together, and tries to gauge its productivity. Interestingly, this measure of productivity growth has been relatively flat recently compared to, if you go back to the 1990s, for example. You see the rate of growth of overall productivity growth in the 1990s was much more rapid than what we have been experiencing in the last decade, which is a bit of a paradox. Might have a lot to do with the fact that much of the innovation that we hear about still remains relatively bottled up in certain sectors of the economy, and that large sectors have not yet been affected, so they doesn't show up. The effects don't quite show up after all. Now, what about inequality? You're, of course, aware of these broad patterns of inequality, and this is a picture that I assume from work by Thomas Piketty and his co-authors that I'm sure many of you have seen, that there's been a significant increase in inequality, particularly in the UK, the United States, and to some extent in Canada and Australia as well. And this shows the income share of the top 1% in total income. So that's just one measure of inequality. It's the share of income that accrues to the top 1% of the population. You can see that in a country like the UK or the United States, it was around 20% all the way back before the First World War. That's sort of the highest levels of inequality that has really been recorded with these measures. And then during the process of the two world wars and subsequently, inequality declined significantly, but has been rising again since the 1980s and 1990s. This is especially inequality at the very top. This is a sort of income concentration at the very top, to the point where inequality in the United States has basically reached the levels that existed prior to the First World War. I don't think I have inequality charts or the analogous charts for other countries, but you should also know that this is not a feature that's been experienced by all advanced industrial countries, that this rise in inequality has been most striking and most in evidence in these countries, in the so-called sort of the Anglo-American group of countries. And that in many continental European countries, Germany, for example, inequality has not risen to this quite to this extent. That was inequality within certain countries. If you look at inequality globally, you need to confront another kind of reality. When we talk about global inequality, there are different concepts of that. I think most people who live in the advanced countries immediately think about inequality within their societies. But you could ask the question about global inequality in a different way by saying sort of what has been happening to inequality overall in the world economy. Imagine there were no countries. And you basically looked at inequality across households, across individuals in the entire world without dividing up the world into different kinds of countries. So that global inequality is going to be made up of two different components. It's going to be made up of inequalities within countries, but it's also going to be made up by inequalities across countries. So average incomes across different countries are very different, so that's going to contribute to global inequality. But also inequalities within countries are also going to contribute to that. So this picture, which shows the global distribution of income in two different periods or two different dates in 1988 and 2011, showed this sort of global distribution, sort of, if you will, the most comprehensive distribution of inequality in the world economy. So to see what this is saying, first, look at the one for 1988 first, the inequality picture for 1988. What do you see there? It's, you know, sort of, the inequality is basically has two kinds of peaks. One very distinguished peak at a relatively low level of income, and then a second kind of a peak at a relatively high level of income. So what this is loosely saying is that back in 1988, the world economy was sort of divided into two kinds of countries. The relatively rich countries, where with the mass of people lived in relatively rich countries, where the second lower peak is, but at a higher level of income, and a much more populous group of low-income countries with around the peak at the low end of the income. So the world economy was really divided. Households were really split between two types of countries. The interesting thing is that when you look at the income distribution for 2011, there are two things that have changed. One is that, I don't know if you can actually tell this from this chart. One is that actually any measure of inequality, which is sort of the dispersion of this curve, right, has shrunk. Inequality in the global economy has actually come down. So in other words, you know, the support of that second distribution, 2011 distribution, is much narrower than the support of the earlier distribution. So global inequality has actually been reduced. And related to that, when you look at the curve for 2011, it's no longer a two-humped kind of a curve. The middle of the curve has begun to fill up. So in some sense, if you will, it's almost like we're creating a global middle class, except that, of course, that levels of income for that global middle income is much, much lower still than anything you would consider in terms of a middle class in an advanced country. Now, what's responsible for that shrinking of the support of the income distribution? It's related to the growth patterns I've shown you before, that as low-income countries, in particular China and later India, have grown very, very rapidly. A lot of poor countries have been moving up in this global, a lot of poor households, a lot of poor people have been moving up in this global distribution more towards the middle. And that has been the single biggest contributor to the decline in global inequality in the world, that developing countries, some of the poorest countries in the world, have actually grown much more rapidly than the rich countries. Okay? Now, this is so despite the fact that if you look at, for example, what has happened to inequality in China, inequality within China has increased significantly in this period, just like inequality in the United States or the UK. So within country inequality has increased both in some of the poorest countries and some of the richest countries in the world from the vintage point of, let's say, the 1980s. Okay? But global inequality has actually declined because most of the households in the poorest countries have been pulled up by overall economic growth, and therefore they are less poor than they used to be. So the answer to the question is what has happened to inequality in the world is actually quite a complicated one. And you need to hold in your mind a number of different trends that global inequality as a whole has actually declined. It's declined largely because some of the poorest countries have grown much more rapidly in the last 2 or 3 decades than the advanced countries. But at the same time, in many countries, both advanced and poor, inequalities within countries have increased. Okay? So that means that in terms of our discussion of inequality, that we will need to be in tune or attuned to these different conceptions of inequality and different trends in these concepts. I haven't made clear, but by the way, if you have any questions, please do interrupt me for clarification. Okay? Let me go on now to ultimately, of course, it's not the only thing, but we might care a lot about poverty. What has happened to poverty, particularly in the poor countries? One way that we measure poverty is by calculating what's called the poverty headcount ratio. That's the number of people in a country or in a region that is below an arbitrary poverty line. So here, the arbitrary poverty line is $2 a day, which used to be sort of this is actually it used to be $1 a day. Then it's sort of inflation increased it to around 2, and it's actually a little bit higher than 2 now. But that's just sort of one arbitrary cutoff. And then you look at the percent of population which is below that arbitrary cutoff, and that gives you the poverty headcount ratio. The biggest decline in poverty around the world has happened in Asia, particularly in East Asia. Okay? That, again, maybe should not be a surprise unless you're sort of somebody who's very critical of the value of economic growth. And you would say, why didn't you begin by showing us those charts on growth? Who cares about growth? That decline in poverty in East Asia would not have been possible without the kind of growth that East Asia experienced. In fact, that growth is more than 100% explains this decline in poverty reduction. Why more than 100%? Well, because inequality has increased in these countries. So in other words, even though inequality in China has increased significantly, the people at the very bottom are still much better off than they were. It's just that they did not do nearly as well as the people at the very top, but they still have benefited significantly. In other parts of the world, the decline in poverty is not nearly as striking. In particular, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, which we might care about, because it is now the poorest region in the world. Sub-Saharan Africa is the blue one, and it's relatively flat. Recent growth has been bringing it down a little bit, but not as much as you might have hoped or expected. So poverty still remains a significant problem in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as, of course, South Asia, which follows a trend that's fairly similar to that of sub-Saharan Africa. Okay. Now, this is the famous, to complete the discussion on global inequality, this is the famous elephant chart. How many of you have heard of the elephant chart of Milanovic, Branko Milanovic? And so if you haven't seen it, it's sort of interesting because it shows sort of what has been happening to the global income distribution and who, so to speak, are the winners and the losers of changes in the global economy since the late 1980s. Okay? And what this chart shows is basically, in the horizontal axis is sort of where you were in the overall global income distribution at the beginning of the period in the late 1980s. So, people who were poor were at the very sort of the lower deciles of the income distribution globally, and the people who were rich were in the highest. And the vertical axis is basically what happened to your income. What was the percent change in your income in the intervening period? Okay? So this basically is telling us sort of what happened to your income depending on where you were in the global income distribution during this period. Okay? So it's a funny shape that is basically showing that, sort of first, there were two winners, right? The ones that were the high points. Who are the winners? First, the very richest. Okay, they did really well. The top 1%, right? Their incomes rose significantly. And then the second winners, the back of the elephant, right? And who were those? And those were the people that I said became the global middle class. But those were basically the bulk of the population in East Asia, China and India, rapidly growing countries. Okay, so that's the middle of that distribution. Okay, so you were the developing countries that grew rapidly, most of the people there, and then the top 1% of the global, therefore advanced income countries, they did very well. Who didn't do so well? Well, if you were very poor, you didn't do all that well. And then, sort of the interesting thing is what happened around the 80th percentile. Who are those people? Those are the people, the bulk of the population in the advanced countries. So they didn't do very well. So these are the groups that ultimately, of course, become the disenchanted voters who are going to reject established political parties and become the source of support for populist parties that I'll come to in a second. Now, this, interestingly, stops at 2008. So we have some estimates for what this might look like since 2008. I think the most significant change, if you were to update this, let's say for the last decade, would be that, the tail, I mean what do you call it? Trunk of the elephant stays the same. Okay, so the 1% are still doing very well, but sort of the back of the elephant has come down. So it's more like an elephant who's lying down with a trunk that just sort of is staying up. Yeah.
I just want to clarify to see whether I understand this correctly. Since it's a percentile, so if we're looking at the 80th percentile,
yeah.
I'm not sure if we can understand it as the middle class in advanced economies, because what it says, if I understand it correctly, is that people who are at the 80th percentile back in 1988
yes.
at the same level of income as the 90th percentile people in 2008. But it doesn't tell us the composition of people who are at the 80th percentile. So it might well as be, back in the 1988, the 80th percentile people are a typical, say, American family middle class. But 2008 might have just been a typical, say, Chinese family. So I don't know if the argument about advanced.
Yeah. So therefore, it's important to be clear as to when you say people in the 80th percentile. Do you mean 80th percentile at the beginning of the period, or at the beginning, or sometime throughout? So this, I believe, is where it's 80th percentile at the beginning of the period. So that if there were, so let me say that people who were in the 60th or 17th percentile might have moved up to the 80th percentile by 2008. But they're still shown at 60th and 70th percentile here. But you see that they have done really well compared to the 80th percentile. So over time, of course, there is this reordering that's going on, which is what you're pointing out, that if you look at this at different points in time, households in different countries are going to be ordered differently on this scale. Yes?
Can I ask, for that sort of 75th, 90th percentile, how much of it is what people from the former communist countries versus people from former, I guess you say, advancing countries?
Yeah, good question. I think the performance in the former communist countries has been very, very heterogeneous, very uneven. A few of them, Poland overall has done very well, and a few others in Eastern Europe have done very well. But large numbers have not done so well. So I think it's quite possible that some of them are in there too, but they wouldn't form the bulk of it, just in terms of overall population. It's an interesting question of where Russia would be in here. I don't know exactly what the answer to that is. That's a good question. Yeah. Okay, let me just move on to sort of talk a little bit about overall trends in globalization. One of the themes that we'll keep coming back to here is sort of both the extent to which globalization contributes to many of these outcomes, as well as the extent to which we can redesign globalization and its rules to have sort of both sustain economic growth, but do it in a more inclusive kind of a way. So this takes the story of globalization fairly far back to the sort of the tail end of the 19th century to make the point that we are not really, this is not the first time that we have had a significant flowering of globalization. That in fact, the tail end of the 19th century, typically the period that's sort of characterized between 1880 to 1914, was another period of high globalization, particularly in the world of international finance, a period of globalization that was sustained by the gold standard, where essentially money and capital were free to move around the world, and they did, in fact, they did so at levels approaching today. And then you have that first period of globalization, then is followed with the collapse of globalization in the interwar period, and a subsequent increase since the end of the Second World War, which brings us to today. So two lessons from this. One is that this is not the first time that we have very high degree of globalization. Secondly, just don't assume that globalization is irreversible, that we actually have had a significant reversal in globalization in the interwar period with the collapse of the gold standard, with significant protectionism, and of course, restrictions on the movement of people and immigration restrictions as well. There has been a little bit of deglobalization in recent years, so you have to look really up close to see it. Most of it is actually in terms of finance. That finance has become a little bit more national since and less global, less internationalized since the global financial crisis. This is most evident in Europe, where the euro crisis has resulted in a significant degree of renationalization of finance and the emergence of country risks and sovereign risks in different parts of the euro. A second kind of reason behind the slowing down, if not the reversal, of the trade, not the financial aspect of globalization, but the trade aspect of globalization, is that we seem to have reached a kind of a peak in terms of the slicing of the global, in terms of the expansion of global value chains. That is that, a lot of the increase in world trade in the last few decades was due to the fact that it became possible not just simply to produce different products in different parts of the world, but to actually produce different tasks in different parts of the world. And that meant that you could simply create these very elaborate global value chains of producing sort of different parts and tasks of particularly electronics or textiles and autos in different parts of the world. And that seems to have been reached a kind of a peak. The third thing is, of course, is that there is some retrenchment of China's exports, that China is not expanding its trade nearly as rapidly as it was before, and China is also bringing some of its supply chains back home, and that's creating putting a downward pressure on sort of overall volumes of trade. Yeah.
Just a question on your measure of 14 percentage points from the peak to this new level. I think Olivier Blanchard a few years back mentioned that he cut off, in terms of trends analytics, he cut off at 2004 because 2005 to 2007 clearly was a bubble. So if you cut off at 2004 here, the break is of course much less dramatic, and probably you would also put in a dummy for the euro crisis and maybe so I mean,
yeah.
if you look more at the trend and cut off this anomaly, it's rather slowing down that you described than a break, right?
No, I think that's a good point. I think, as in fact, this picture makes clear, there was this very sort of very rapid increase in this trend line before 2008 is due to finance. And you might say, as you rightly are saying, that might have been sort of the building up, of the bubble that eventually burst with the global financial crisis. In some sense, that was unnatural, unsustainable, wasn't going to keep going. And then what you had is the bursting of that bubble. And as you rightly say, I think, that it's less a reversal. When you take that out, it's less of a reversal than more of a slowing down, if you will. I think that's largely right. Okay, we know that in this sort of relatively advanced stages of globalization, the discontent with globalization has been increasing. This is different in different parts of the world. Of course, developing countries tend to, if you survey people in developing countries, they seem to be much less anti-globalization than the population in the advanced countries. And you might link it very, informally to the fact that, in fact, as I've shown you, that developing countries on the whole have done rather well in the last few decades. But if you ask countries, particularly in the United States, sort of their views on statements like trade creates jobs, trade raises wages, and foreign companies buying domestic companies is a good thing, you get a significant amount of people expressing negative sentiment about these. And finally, on populism, I think the sort of the political reaction to that has been, of course, another important recent phenomenon that is very much the background to our discussion here, which is the political phenomenon of populism. This has been, the rise in populism has been particularly rapid in the last few years. Of course, in everybody's mind, we associate it with the Brexit vote in 2016 and the election of Trump in this country. But what this chart shows is that, in fact, if you look systematically at the support that populist parties have been getting, this is something that's been brewing for some time, that this increase in populist support has been going on for some time, that it is not just 2016, it's not just Britain and the United States. Now, I'll come to in a second on sort of what I mean by populism, and we might have a discussion about that with Roberto. But the other thing about populism that's interesting, especially those of you who are from sort of Europe versus Latin America, is that there are different varieties of populism. One distinction that is made in the literature is between right-wing and left-wing populism. I'll define that distinction on the basis of what kind of cleavage in society these tend to run on. But instinctively or intuitively, sort of left-wing populism is much more directed at sort of financial elites, multinational corporations, foreign investors, and that's the kind of populism that those of you from Latin America are much more familiar with, because populism in Latin America is a very, very long, I'm not going to say distinguished, but sort of has a long history. And it's mostly a kind of a left-wing type populism that doesn't run off of ethno-nationalistic or cultural cleavages. Whereas in Europe, if you look at the left panel, the recent rise in populism has been almost exclusively of the right-wing variety, which is a kind of populism that runs off of a religious, ethno-nationalistic kind of a cleavage, where the distinction is between us, people who look like us, versus immigrants, foreigners, and people who are different from us. Now, this kind of populist backlash or reaction seems to sort of have a certain kind of relationship with the globalization cycle. I think probably the earliest self-consciously populist movement in history actually was the one in the United States, the People's Party in the 1880s in the United States. And those populists, who by my definition were left-wing populists, they took aim precisely at the defining characteristics of globalization of their era, which was the gold standard. The populists in the United States were essentially a coalition of farmers and miners. So essentially, people in the South and the West aligned against what they saw were the financial interests of the Northeast and in New York, who were supporters, were upholders of the gold standard. And why was the gold standard bad? Because the gold standard meant, for them, what today we would call policies of austerity, policies where essentially monetary policy was an automatic pilot. Interest rates, real interest rates were high, and that financial interests were keeping the farmers poor. They were exploiting them because of this high debt burden that the farmers had and the high real interest rate cost. And this problem would disappear if you got rid of the gold standard, which, in other words, were able, in terms of the debate of that day, if you were to monetize silver, essentially you could increase the money supply. Increasing the money supply would allow you to bring in interest rates down, and that would essentially reduce the burden that farmers were facing in terms of their debts. And of course, monetizing silver would be a boon to the mining regions of the country. So the western parts were allied, at least partly, because of that. So if you go back all the way back to the very first populist movement in history, the U.S. People's Party, that was very much one that was aligned against populism. And in many ways today, of course, the opposition to or the backlash to globalization is taking on very much same on sort of very similar kind of terms. Sort of coming back to this distinction between right-wing versus left-wing populism, I think the way I think about it is in terms of sort of different divisions or different cleavages in society, and you could essentially build a populist claim in terms of who the people is and who the enemies of the people are, based on one or the other of these existing cleavages. So you could define a cleavage based on economic claims in terms of inequalities in income, wealth, and opportunity. That would define one type of populist movement. Or you could define the people in terms of cultural cleavages, in terms of racial, ethnic, national, or religious identity, and that would define who the people is and therefore who the enemies of the people are quite differently. So I think when, in terms of trying to understand what populism is, I think it's important to distinguish what I would call the demand side of populism, which is sort of a kind of a generalized discontent that arises from many of these empirical facts that I've went through, sort of the the kind of the rising inequality in many countries, the deepening of many of these the cleavages, the impact of technology that we'll talk about later. That this kind of generalized discontent that this creates has to be channeled into politics. And the manner in which this gets channeled is shaped by the supply side of politics. That is the candidates, the parties, the movements that is able to sort of channelize this generalized discontent. And that could be channeled either through a kind of a right-wing populism or a kind of left-wing populism, depending on whether it is a kind of a identity or cultural cleavage that is being exploited, or an income social class cleavage that is being exploited. Now, I haven't been explicit about what populism is. I think the reading for today by Jan Werner Müller, I think, is quite good about that. I think the distinctive thing about populism is its claim to represent and speak for the people. So there's a notion that there's a people, the definition of which, of course, depends on whether its populism comes in its left-wing or right-wing variety. And because populists represent the people at large, populism in the actual practice of politics rejects restraints on the will of the people. So that since a populist leader represents the people, that any restraint on what that leader can do is illegitimate. So therefore, in the political sphere, what that means is that populists tend to reject the institutions that we associate with political liberalism. A free media, independence of the judiciary, separation of powers. So those agencies of restraints are rejected by the very logic of the populist notion of the people and the will of the people. And in the economic domain, that rejection of institutions of restraint finds its reflection in rejecting the economic analogs of those restraints, which is things like the use of technocrats, delegation to autonomous regulatory agencies, independent central banks, the signing of trade agreements, all of which place constraints on what the executive can do, and by virtue of limiting what how the popular will can be expressed, are therefore necessarily inimical to the interests of the people. Now, I would say that the political and the economic dimensions of populism are not at all at the same level. That I would say that the political dimension is particularly dangerous, whereas I think there's a lot of debate to be had about the appropriateness of many of these restraints in the economic dimension in the first instance. Okay? So if you want to think about a kind of a taxonomy that takes sort of this 2x2 between the political and the economic, that is, the rejection of institutions of restraint on the politics versus the economic dimensions. And you can think about different types of regimes characterized by whether they reject one or the other. Now, it's interesting that you can have regimes that are populist in political terms, but not populist in economic terms. For example, so that would be a kind of so rejecting political restraints, yes, but not rejecting restraints on economic policy. So that would be a kind of a liberal, so accepting. So let me see, how does this, let me make sure that I get this right. So start from the top left-hand side box. So that would be a case where you reject restraints on both economic and political dimensions. So this would be an example of a personalistic autocracy, right? So maybe we'll put some names of these. How's that? Okay. But you can imagine a case where there are sort of political restraints are rejected, but economic restraints are accepted. So that would be Pinochet, because Pinochet was all about putting economic policy on automatic pilot, and sort of having the Chicago boys, the technocrats, and sort of and free capital mobility and rules on tariffs and international trade to run everything. Whereas of course he had wanted full autonomy on the political dimension. So that was an authoritarian technocracy is what I've called it. So that's you can have that kind of a regime. You can have, sort of going to the bottom right, what I've called a liberal technocracy, can basically, accept restraints both in politics and economics, but also, as the sort of, I call it liberal technocracy, so I give it a kind of a normatively negative edge. And what I mean by that, essentially, you're taking too much of economic policy out of what people can control. So the problem, in some sense, in Europe is that economic policy making is made by sort of technocratic bodies and well-insulated groups and an autonomous independent central bank, and whereas politics takes place at the level of nation states, and the reach between politics and where the policies are and where decision making is taking place is too distant. So I gave that as an example. So you can also have a populist democracy. So maybe I should have put, we don't know how Sanders would have run, but in some ways there was less doubt about, the economic views of Sanders were fairly populist, but there was less sense that Sanders would reject the kind of basic norms of liberal democracy in terms of the various institutions of restraints in the way that perhaps Trump has. So this is just, So these are the big questions that we want to discuss in this course. So is the rise of authoritarianism and populism inevitable? How can we address problems of low growth and inequality? And all of this sort of, the big question really is sort of what are the kinds of alternatives to current forms of capitalism and globalization that can stimulate inclusive growth and inclusive innovation. We could imagine a world in which sort of we move sort of business as usual, okay? But that may not be sustainable. We can have a world in which what Michael Lind in the reading for today calls neoliberalism plus, by which he means essentially business as usual, but let's do better at compensating the losers. Okay, so this is, basically, we move along the same path as we've been, but recognize that many people have been left behind, and therefore what we need to do is do a much better job of creating safety nets, much better job of redistribution, much better job of compensating people. Okay, that's essentially, if you will, what a lot of the mainstream has moved to in terms of thinking about where to move. There's a somewhat associated idea with that, or maybe not. It's a kind of a different idea, which sort of says that our problems are largely global, and therefore what we need are better institutions of global governance. So that means that we need sort of, to work globally to increase the efficacy of our various global networks and alliances. And by the way, that doesn't mean just intergovernmental. It means also NGOs. It means individual groups. It means all of us as sort of quote-unquote global citizens engage in global activities where we essentially rewrite the rules of the global economy, but at the global level. Sort of get rid of tax havens, ensure that we have politically sustainable rules on climate change, fix finance globally, upgrade labor standards globally through these global conversations, which bring together civil society organizations, multinational corporations, labor unions all together. So that's kind of the global governance solution to this. Then there are sort of a much more sort of radical set of national solutions, where the argument is going to be that the solutions actually don't lie at this global level. They're going to lie at the national level. But what those are, in turn, could take many, many different forms. In many ways, the kind of right-wing populist solution to these takes place at the national level because populists make very clear that that they reject globalization and these global solutions, that they want to make these rules nationally. But their solution to this is largely isolationism, protectionism, and a return to a kind of idealized kind of 1950s solution, if you will. You can imagine a process of significant renationalization, and this would have to extend to the innovative parts. You can imagine a path of what, again, Michael Lind calls developmentalism. And developmentalism, he means, is essentially a kind of East Asian model of significant government-led reindustrialization and government-led productivist approach in alliance and in collaboration with the private sector that is aimed at revitalizing the economic structure of these countries, but in essentially a national kind of a setting. And then you can think about sort of the last two paths, which a lot of our discussions here are really going to be focusing on, in distinction to many of these other paths that's listed on this slide. That is to sort of think about how we can democratize the innovation economy, and think about how what Roberto calls how we can practice, engage in democratic experimentalism, which is to sort of redesign the underlying institutions of capitalism in a way that is essentially forward-looking and constantly being revised, but in a kind of a democratic way, but also in a way that explicitly rejects a kind of a traditional liberal democratic approach as embedded in the actual US practice of politics, which I think Roberto is going to argue is not actually consistent with the practice of democratic experimentalism and the politics that goes with it. Okay, I'm purposefully being quite telescopic here, just give you a sense of what some of our discussions are going to be. And I'll just stop and turn it over to Roberto.
Maybe we should ask the class.
If you have any questions or comments at this stage, but we want to make sure to leave some time for Roberto, you too.
Absolutely, there's plenty of time.
Go ahead.
I was just a little bit curious about the development, the growth graphs that you showed at the very beginning. I was wondering, between the 1950s until 1990, is there a difference between reconstruction and growth? In the sense that after the war, is that really growth, or is that just rebuilding what you had, especially in Western Europe? And then similarly, where does the Soviet Union fall in between those years? Is that a developed nation, or is that a developing country? Until 1990, obviously, because it no longer exists. But
yeah, for this chart, it wouldn't matter because it would never be a large enough part of the aggregate. It wouldn't have mattered. I think I left Soviet Union and then Russia out of this picture, but it would not have changed. But the first point you make is useful, and it's quite a relevant point, because a lot of you might say that a lot of the high growth in the immediate period after the Second World War, particularly in Western Europe, is just reconstruction. So what we mean by reconstruction is essentially societies that have their capital stock depleted, destroyed, right? But their essential human and societal infrastructure not necessarily still in place. So those societies might have actually been different than simply growth, where you're basically trying to not just build up your capital stock, but you're also trying to improve your institutions, your human capital, and so forth. So that might be much higher, much more difficult growth, is I think what you're saying. So I think, yes, there is something to it that some of that very high growth in the early period after, particularly in Western Europe, is because of sort of recovery from the catastrophe of the war. Yeah.
Building on that point, I'm also wondering whether like 1915 is too short a time frame, because correct me if I'm wrong, but if you look at the Industrial Revolution, per capita growth rates were like quite low, like 0.5% for like years, and it wasn't like a real
Yes.
problem. In hindsight, you would still say it was quite a successful time for many countries.
That's certainly true about the Industrial Revolution. In fact, if you do this for the 18th century, you cannot find when the Industrial Revolution happened because there's no perceptible uptick in growth that's associated with Industrial Revolution. Yes, but what's the point? So
It's that big of a problem if we say, of course, it's like not nice if growth slows down compared to 1915, 60, 70, but whether it's really like a fundamental problem,
Yes.
like which needs to address that urgently.
Yeah, so you were saying that maybe, like 20, 30 years, if you extend this, if you knew what, maybe, it'll just pick up again. So I can, it could be, but I think, we're now, it's like a 60-year period, and probably that downward trend probably, I would say it's meaningful. Yeah. Anything else? Any introductory comments on the substance?
I have a question.
Yes.
A year ago, I spent 6 weeks trying to write about populism. So I asked 10 different people, different political scientists, for a meaning of populism. I got 10 different answers. One even said, eco-populism, a politician you don't like. So my question here is there a theory with T, a capital T, on populism? And if there isn't, is that a problem for us when we talk about it?
I think Roberto might say something about that, but let me just say, and this might be a good place to turn to him after my quick answer. I think the political scientists, in fact, my definition of populism here comes from political scientists. People like Jan Werner Müller, Kasmude, Kaltwasser, who have written sort of on populism, are probably the best known authors. And I think they disagree on many things, but they disagree on this particular definition, which is the claim that what's distinctive about populism is their view that they represent a unified single people. And that makes it different from pluralism or liberalism, from the notion that there are different interests. After all, in populism, you don't have different interests. The people have a single interest expressed in the popular will. It's also different from other kinds of autocracies, or they wouldn't, of course, call them autocracies, because it explicitly represents the people as opposed to the interests of the sovereign or the crown or the oligarchs or the elites. So I think that at that level, I think there's a fair amount of convergence on that definition. That I think beyond that, maybe there might be a lot of disagreement about what that means. But I would say that that with respect to that first point and the first bullet point here, I think that's fairly commonly accepted. You will disagree.
Let me begin by restating my view of the general subject matter of the course. And then I want to propose a conception of 3 themes that can help organize our discussion here during the semester. The foreground theme of the course is the nature and workings of the market economy and its alternative futures. And the background theme is how to think about transformation, how to think about the structural transformation of the economic order, given that there is no indisputable source of insight into the ideas that we require. Now, the problem is that stated in this way, the subject matter of the course is the world debate. And it leaves us with an an amorphous field of inquiry that we must somehow find a way to organize. So it is in that spirit, then, that I suggest 3 thematic focal points for the organization of our inquiry. The first, which historically lies at the origin of our conception of this course, is the rise of populism, the subject that Danny Roderick has just addressed. The most widely professed social economic goal in the world today is the commitment to promote socially inclusive economic growth. The failure or the uncertain record of this commitment has in turn provoked the rise of what we call populism. So at the origin of our project here in this course was the response to populism, or the attempt to identify the alternative to populism. But then, of course, the question arises right at the start, what is populism? And I, therefore, want to begin by attempting to deconstruct the discourse about populism. Now, let me begin in the United States. The traditional naive American conception of populism is that the populist is the defender of the interests of the common working people against the interests and the ideas of the elites. So the traditional American conception of populism was positive. Many years ago in Brazil, I met a man called Tip O'Neill, who was at that time the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He said to me, I'm a populist like you, speaking in the good old idiom of American populism, of American politics. And I answered, well, that's great. Now all we need is to figure out what to do. That was the old American conception of populism. Now we have in the world another critical, analytical conception of populism, which intends to be a condemnation of populism. I think it's a confused conception. And we can't progress until we dispel the confusion and reconstruct it in some way. The new conception of populism is specifically a European conception. And its anchor, its headquarters, or the mainstream of European populism diffused throughout the world. Social liberalism, liberalism in the European sense of the defense of the market, social democracy, and what you could generically call technocratic centrism, the dominant project now in the North Atlantic world. The dominant project of the elites in the North Atlantic world is the reconciliation of American-style economic flexibility with European-style social protection within a barely adjusted version of the inherited institutional arrangements. On this European conception, what then is populism? Populism is political mendacity. So populism is the insinuation of a way of satisfying the interests and aspirations of the broad working class majority that has no basis in economic reality. So it's a confidence trick. That's what populism is. And this elitist European conception of populism, centered in what I'm calling technocratic centrism, was historically prefigured in practical economics, and specifically in the debates of the mainstream economists against the Latin American progressives of the closing decades of the 20th century. Like many progressives in the world, they had lost faith in Marxism and in statism, and they then sought refuge in vulgar Keynesianism, spending, and compensatory redistribution. Deficit finance, and that was populism. That was the economic prefigurement of this European elitist conception of populism, which has now been imported into the United States. Now, there's a confusion. Real transformation, I want to argue in my interventions here in this course throughout the semester, depends on structural change. Everything in social and economic reality depends on the organization of the regime and on the institutions that define it. It is not possible to achieve substantive change without institutional innovation. So if we try to make sense of this reconstructed, critical, analytic conception of populism, we would have to say populism is the pretense of achieving significant change in the interests of the working class majority without structural innovation. It cannot work. But now then there is a problem in applying this clarified conception of populism to the actual agents in the contemporary political debates. Who are the populists? So let's make a list of the points of cleavage. So first, there's the conception of economic growth, the strategy of economic growth. Let's take the United States as an example. What is the strategy of economic growth that is now embraced by the American elites? It appears that they have no strategy. Their residual strategy of easy growth of economic growth is easy money, which they have subcontracted to the central bank. And this strategy has had an indifferent result. It's not been completely a failure for two reasons. The first reason is the inherent dynamism of the American economy. And the second reason is the unique role of the United States and of the dollar in the world economy, which has made it possible for the Americans to sustain their credit and debt fuel style of growth on the basis of the Chinese capital and trade surpluses. Now, this idea that there's an easy way to growth through easy money is an idea that the technocratic centrists in the United States and elsewhere have shared with their so-called populist adversaries. On July 9th, 1896, William Jennings Bryan, in accepting the nomination of the Democratic Party for the presidency of the United States, said, "You will not crucify mankind on a cross of gold." He was an apostate from the gold standard. And he was condemned by the American elites at that time as a demagogue, as what they would now call a populist. The people who hold the views of those who then condemned him are now regarded as cranks. That was the debate about monetary policy and economic growth. Now let's take the second issue, the situation of industry. So there's a crisis of traditional mass production industry. It will be a subject of discussion here in this course. And what do the different political agents propose with respect to this crisis? Both the so-called populists and the technocratic centrists, the social liberals or the social democrats. It seems that what they propose is to allow traditional declining mass production industry to have a few more years, placing restraints on plant closings or subcontracting. They have no idea of the structural conversion of this form of production into something else. And that doesn't distinguish them. The populists and the anti-populists have the same ideas. Now let's take a third theme on this list. The third theme would be redistribution. Now, what do they think? They think that the way to achieve compensatory redistribution and to attenuate inequalities in the market economy is to emphasize progressive taxation. These are the left-wing populists. And the right-wing populists might think, well, it's better just to do whatever will stimulate investment in the hope that this will produce an excess that can trickle down and benefit the majority of the people. But do the technocratic centrists, the enemies of populism, have another idea? It seems that they don't. That's their same idea. Their idea is that the market economy is what it is. It generates certain inequalities, and these inequalities have to be redressed after the fact through compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer. Now, it seems very clear that compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer has only a marginal effect on inequality. It can have a great significance in allowing for investment in people and in their capabilities. But its effect on inequality is modest. And all contemporary experience confirms that. So when the technocratic centrists, like the populists, promise to diminish inequality by compensatory redistribution through tax and transfer, they're lying or they're deceiving themselves. Now we come to a fourth theme on the list. And this is the theme on which there is indeed a divergence between the technocratic centrists or the social liberals or social democrats on one side and the right-wing populists on the other side. And that theme of divergence is immigration. So then the right-wing populists make two claims: a narrower economic claim and a broader social economic claim. The narrower economic claim is that widespread immigration of low-skilled labor is inimical to the economic interests of low-skilled workers at home. Now, in that narrow dispute, the right-wing populists are indisputably correct. And I say that myself as a leftist. Then the right-wing populists make a broader claim. The broader claim is that in a relatively homogeneous society, ethnically, religiously, and culturally homogeneous, the subversion of homogeneity erodes the basis of the social compact under traditional social democracy. You can take an empirical proxy for social solidarity under social democracy, which is the willingness of people to make sacrifice for the sake of other people's children. And the empirical question is, will that willingness be eroded by the diminishment of ethnic, cultural, and religious homogeneity? The answer to that question is also indisputably yes. The right-wing populists in that dispute are correct, empirically. There are all sorts of reasons why you would support widespread immigration, the circulation of people, economic, political, and moral. But in this dispute that I have described, the right-wing populists are not lying. They are telling the truth. So now there's a confusion in this debate about populism. I've just described the terms of the debate. In this reconstructed conception of populism, that the populists are the ones who are tricking or pretending, as opposed to the old naive American conception of populism. On the basis of this reconstructed conception of populism, who are the populists? And the answer is almost everyone. They're all populists. Not just the right-wing or left-wing so-called populists, but the social liberals, the social democrats, the technocratic centrists who govern these countries. They're all populists. They're all confused or lying or self-deceived because they have no structural conception. And who are the anti-populists or the post-populists? We are they. That's why we're here. That's the purpose of this inquiry. So the central subject, which is the provocation for this course, is the imagination of structural alternatives, the absence of which is the salient feature in the contemporary political economic situation. Now, what about politics? As Danny Roderick mentioned, this idea of political populism. In the history of political theory, the technical term for this phenomenon is Caesarism. And there's no simple one-to-one relation between economic populism and Caesarism. What is Caesarism? The term comes from the disputes of the Roman Republic in its final period. The contenders for power claim to represent the dispossessed, the interests of the dispossessed majority, and are willing to undermine the institutional rules the underlying conception, which has been preserved in contemporary conservative political science, is that politics must ultimately be of two kinds. Either it is cold and institutional, or it is hot and anti or extra institutional. So on this view, politics goes in two directions, either toward Madison or toward Mussolini. And Caesarism is the Mussolini direction of politics that is hot and anti or extra institutional. Now, there's a loose relation between Caesarism and economic populism, because the Caesarists, the contenders for power, will want to placate the masses, this popular base. With or without structural change, to achieve and to maintain power. But there's also a deeper connection of the following kind, which has great interest for our discussion here. Caesarism is a kind of liquefaction in politics. It is a melting down of the frozen institutional arrangements through its anti-institutional or extra-institutional agitation that begins in politics and then advances into the economic order. And the fundamental question in politics is always, what comes next? So the question is, once these structures have been melted down in the fire of popular agitation, will there emerge another set of structures or not? Will there be an institutional legacy or not? In other words, one has to think about the phenomenon of populism dynamically and not just statically. And the melting down in the Caesarist moment can be an episode in the recreation of the structure. So that's how I understand the provocation for our course here. And it begins, from my standpoint, in the rejection, in the denunciation of this confused elitist conception of populism, which is based on a fundamental equivocation, namely that the technocratic centrists are different somehow from their populist enemies, that they're not confused. Not only do they share the same fundamental confusion, but they basically have the same program. That's the reality of the situation, and the whole representation of the established debate on the world is based on the denial of that fact. Now comes the second theme in the course, organizing our debate here. And this was a theme that we had not originally thought about when we conceived the course. We taught it last year. But it emerged during the semester, and I hope that it will play a major role in our conversations here. The theme is the theme of the new form of production, the advanced form of production, which we can call the knowledge economy. In every historical period, there is a most advanced practice of production. The two greatest economic theorists in the history of economics, Adam Smith and Karl Marx, both understood that the best way to grasp the underlying realities of the economy is to study the most advanced practice of production. In their period, it was mechanized manufacturing. And now it's something else. It's this new form of production which is dense in knowledge and dedicated to permanent innovation. We associate it with radical technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning. But as I hope to argue in the course of the semester, it has a character that far transcends its contingent technological instruments. Now, what happened in the past with respect to earlier, most advanced practices of production, and in particular industrial mass production, is that the model of the most advanced practice of production was rapidly disseminated throughout the economy. Now we have a most advanced practice of production that instead of being disseminated throughout the whole of the economy is quarantined. It is confined to insular vanguards from which the vast majority of the labor force is excluded. You know that now in the United States, for example, there is a discourse that goes under the label of secular stagnation, which attempts to naturalize the slowdown in the growth of productivity, claiming, for example, that the contemporary technologies are inherently less transformative than the technologies of 100 years ago. Preposterous. The fundamental cause of economic stagnation in these societies is that their most advanced practice of production is denied to the majority of the labor force, is confined in these little islands, in these fringes, now in each sector of the economy, not just in high technology industry, but in knowledge-intensive services or in precision scientific agriculture. And the result is stagnation, and the result is massive inequality, anchored in the hierarchical segmentation of the economy, in the division between the advanced and the backward sectors, and the traditional devices for the moderation of inequality, which are compensatory redistribution by progressive taxation and social entitlements, or the defense of small business against big business, are completely inadequate to master these vast inequalities. So then the question arises, what can we do? What can we think so that this revolutionary practice of production can be widely disseminated throughout the economy? And that would be the way, the only way, to give practical substance to the widely professed commitment to socially inclusive economic growth. But it would require a whole series of changes in the organization of the economy, in the character of education, and ultimately in the nature of culture and of politics. So in order to think about the economy on this view, we have to transcend the economy. And we have to have a much larger set of ideas. Now we come to the third theme, which I hope will organize our conversation here. And the third theme is, where are we to look for the ideas that can inform this effort to imagine structural change and structural alternatives? And this is the particular point on which Danny Roderick and I have disagreed in the past and are likely to disagree again. So is there a discipline, call it economics, that provides us with universal principles that can guide us in this effort to imagine the structural alternatives. So on one view, we should, this is, I understand to be Danny Roderick's view, we should combat the abusive application of economics when it is enlisted in the service of some narrow institutional formula. It's compatible with a wide range of institutional alternatives. But nevertheless, on this view, it provides us with general principles, like a list or a menu, a direction in which we can think institutionally. That would be very good. Unfortunately, in my view, it's not true. There is no such discipline that provides these universal principles. The history of social and economic thought faces us with a total crisis, a breakdown in our ability to imagine structural alternatives. And it's not just economics. Economics is the most powerful social science, the best organized, deservedly the most influential. And useful, even indispensable, as a science of constraints and of trade-offs. But not the basis for the imagination of alternatives. All of the social disciplines suffer from this problem. At the beginning of Anna Karenina, Tolstoy says, all happy families are alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Each of the social sciences has its peculiar form of unhappiness in its infirmity, in its inability to imagine structural alternatives. That's the real situation. I don't understand this discourse, this project of ours here, as an attempt to enlist the resources of economics in the service of our project. These disciplines have these resources. But they're unable to do what we need to do. So somehow, as they say, we have to reconstruct the raft on the high sea along the way, raiding, cannibalizing the disciplines that exist. But there's no ready-made set of ideas. That's the real situation, as I understand it, that we have to face. So it's terrific to be able to imagine an alternative in engagement, in struggle with the established disciplines. There's nothing like it in our existence other than falling in love. So I urge you to deliver yourself to this experience unconditionally.
Let me just say a couple of things. I hope you're jotting down your questions and comments, and there's time only enough for me to say a couple of words, because I think this has been very useful to be. But I do want to say that this will be. I do hope that everybody is going to be participating in this discussion. That don't take this as us filibustering here and crowding out your participation. But I can't pass. Just to start with the area where I think indeed we will have the biggest disagreements is to put it very crudely, is whether economics has ideas. And I think I will argue that economics has ideas. I don't think nearly as many as we need. But I think the fact that economics has ideas, I would consider a proof by contradiction of the notion that economics does not have ideas. So I'm as much a critic of economics as you're going to find on this campus. Having an economics degree.
Just a correction. I didn't say it doesn't have ideas. I said it doesn't have the right ideas.
Well, economics have ideas in the right ballpark, and I think the evidence for that, I think, is going to be in our, again, I can only prefigure this because I think it'll come out, is that when you try to take many of your ideas, Roberto, that we will be discussing about the nature of structural change in these various areas, the new economy, finance, globalization, education, and so forth. And the more you try to link it to sort of the immediate steps of that program, what it might look like, those immediate steps often will bear significant similarity to many of those things that what I consider to be part of the toolkit of ideas that already exist in economics. Again, not perhaps enough. It can be expanded, but there's in my mind there is actually an interesting and a valuable connection between the practical implications of some of your strategic, deep institutional ideas about the future and what their immediate practical implications might be. And that's where, in fact, I will argue there is a connection between the ideas that exist. Unfortunately, this is a little bit too abstract, but just again, in terms of where I think we might disagree. But I want to, again, in the 2 minutes, I want to come back to sort of the discussion on populism, because I think it's very, very useful. I think one of the things that you've done in what you've talked about is take the unpacking of the concept of populism, which I had sort of started to do in my slides, right, by distinguishing between economic versus political, but take that unpacking and do a much more complete unpacking of what we mean by populism. And I think that's important because we really want to look very specifically in a very detailed fashion in the actual programmatic elements of what we want to do in the service of structural change and its various dimensions. Now, I do think that it's important to distinguish between some element of populism which are quite clearly harmful and dangerous in the way that even a sort of a very limited conception of liberal democracy as practiced in the United States or Madisonian democracy is not. And that's when populist leaders or the Caesars or the Mussolinis or, in today's term, an Orban or an Erdogan tries to achieve complete control of the politics of a country. And I think that's inordinately more harmful than anything that the centrist but still quote-unquote liberal democratic elites would do. So I think that's an important distinction to make. Now, in terms of the programmatic element, I'm simply going to bring up another historical example of FDR. That FDR, in his day, in the 1930s, was very much considered by his opponents as sort of somebody who was centralizing power and who was moving in that that very thin line of somebody who was going to potentially turn, in the eyes of the